Just to remind people at the background, we've organised a series of these workshops, seminars, whatever you want to call them. And the idea is to have a discussion post the election. We've gone past the mourning phase after the election itself, and we're now into talking about what next, where do we go from here. And the idea is away from the sort of fury, or whatever you want to call it, the knockabout of the leadership election. So it's just away from that and just having a discussion about some of the issues that were raised in the election campaign, have been raised in this sort of period of reflection after the election campaign as well, and just talk about where do we go from here. A lot of it for me basically is learning the lessons about the last 4 years, but it's also, to be frank as well, it's also about saying, look, we shouldn't be retreating from positions, we should be building upon them. Yeah, looking at what worked, what didn't, but building upon the overall thrust of two manifestos which actually brought together the party fairly consistently and were relatively popular on the individual content. My view on why we lost in 2019 against 17 it was Brexit, but also we never really wrapped up a whole series of policies into a narrative. And I noticed Richard Leonard the other day quoted from one of my favourite books. It's called The Attack. And there's a number of R.H. Tawney's lectures, articles that were brought together after Labour's defeat in the 1930s. And it basically said what a lot of the criticisms have been about the 2019 election and manifesto is you don't, this is Tawney's language, not mine, when you go into the election, what you don't do is offer a whole series of carrots to donkeys. What you do is you only win elections by creating what he described as a creed. I think it's most probably true. Individual policies can be individually extremely popular. We opinion polling, people who were at the first of these sessions, we looked at the opinion polling on the nationalisation proposals, and all of them were in their 60s or 70% support. But unless you wrap that up in an overall system, a narrative, and you demonstrate how they effectively all contribute towards a central objective, you lose people along the way. And I think that's where we failed to develop that narrative. We had it in 2017, it was easy. We were anti-austerity, that was simple as that. And everything we did was about ending austerity, reversing it, rebuilding. By the time we got to 19, largely the policies were the same, there were some additions, but the narrative had changed, and the narrative was all about Brexit, and we never managed to secure an overall narrative about transforming people's lives that people really got a grip of. So one of these sessions, I think it's the next one, Jackie, isn't it? The next one is about how you communicate, how you create hegemony around the ideas that you want to promote. And it's a panel in the same way. One of the things that's been talked about since the election is the proposals that we've been developing over the last 4 or 5 years around universal basic services. I just can't stand the term. I wish we could just find something different, but I've racked my brains and I can't think of the language yet. And that reflects actually that we weren't able to communicate effectively on some of these ideas. But the concept of universal basic services is that to create I think to create a civilized society, but as you develop towards a socialist society, there are a number of things that you take and you provide them on the basis of need rather than on the basis of profit. And you create, as a result of that, a quality of life in a whole range of aspects. NHS was one of our first universal basic services, but before that there were libraries, and then education as a universal basic service. In the general election, we were arguing actually transport was evolving into a universal basic service that should be provided. And then we threw onto the table, to the delight of some, to the absolute horror of others, free broadband being as a universal basic service. So that's the debate that we're having now about what is the role of UBS as universal basic services in the society that we want to create. Because I actually do think they are part of the foundation stones of a socialist society that we want to create. And that's why I get really annoyed when in the debates that have taken place, people just say, oh, all you were offering was a range of freebies. Yes, they were free. That was the whole idea behind them. Paid for by general taxation, provided people on the basis of need rather than what you could afford to pay or the profits that others could make out of it. And if you don't get that, I think we need to have a proper discussion about what socialism is all about. and it is about the creation of equality through democracy. That's the whole purpose of it. Anyway, that's what these sessions are all about. Reflective, looking at the issues that were raised in the last 4 or 5 years. What next? Where do we go from here? We've invited people along to each of the sessions who are a combination of experts, obviously, within particular fields, but advocates as well around particular policies and particular ideas that we want to develop for the future. And this is what I see my role as. Now, I keep on telling people, people think I'm making up as a joke. I'm now going to evolve into an elder statesman. See, you think it's a joke. Why do you think that's funny? I'm evolving into an elder statesman to encourage discussions and debates like this. It's a bit what Tony Benn used to say. You know, what's my role in life is just to encourage people. It's as simple as that. Okay. Anyway, that's these sessions. We've got another couple of these, and then we're looking at how we develop them on and just taking people's ideas from that as well. And we're working with other groups like the World Transformed, who I think are brilliant in how we determine discussions and debates, because I think we need to talk much more before I think we need to talk much more before we come to some other conclusions as we go into the next election, and that could come sooner than people think. So we need to be prepared. Our first week, let me go through the bio for Jonathan Portes, and Jonathan, tell me if this is wrong or sue us later. Jonathan Portes is Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's College London. Previously, he was Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and prior to that, Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office. You would not survive Cummings, would you? No, you're not weird enough.
That's not a very nice thing to say.
Jonathan's expert. Oh, that's true. That's true. That's true. Jonathan's expertise covers a wide range of economic and social policy issues, including immigration, Brexit, labour markets, skills, poverty, international development, fiscal and microeconomic policy, international economic and financial issues. His current research concentrates on issues related to immigration and labour mobility, both within the European Union and outside, and the economic implications of Brexit and welfare and poverty. Jonathan.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks to Andrew, who got me involved in this project in the first place. To some extent, it is a pleasure to take a break from Brexit, immigration, and Brexit and immigration, which, as many of you will know, is sort of my day job. I said I'd start because I'm going to try and step back and try and look at sort of some of the underlying origins and rationale and a bit of history and what the context is for thinking about UBS. And to me, that really is about the very sharp rise in earnings inequality that we've seen really across the developed world over the last 30 years or so. That is to say that sort of the incomes dictated by the market have become steadily more unequal. That began really actually in the late 70s, after what was then seen as the failure of the post-war Keynesian consensus. Thatcherism was part of it, but it was really part of a much broader global economic phenomenon. And most economists believe that what it is, what's driving that is technological change, that the premium to certain types of skill in the market has gone up. But there are also other things which run alongside that, trade liberalization, globalization in general. But I think it's the interaction of the way that globalization has played itself out with technological change. We've seen very rapid growth in manufacturing productivity. So that means that even though manufacturing output hasn't shrunk much in the UK, we still make almost as much as we ever did, but we do it with far, far fewer people. And that's not going to go away. And information and communication technologies which has advantaged those people who can take advantage of them and disadvantaged those whose skills are relatively easier to automate. And so we've seen job creation and rising wages at the top of the income scale, with job creation but falling or stagnant wages, at least in market terms, at the bottom of the scale. And so the question is, how do those people, if you think that level of inequality that's being generated by this is unacceptable, what do you do about it? And what we did about it under Thatcher and similar governments elsewhere was nothing. We basically said, well, that's what the market's giving you, that's what you have to take. And I think many, and ultimately the political system and politicians and the people decided that wasn't good enough. So we tried something else, which began really in the mid-90s under the Clinton administration, but was very much central to the Blair administration. And I was very much part of this, which was to say, these forces are dictated by the market, and there's a limited amount that you can do about it, because you want to take it, globalization, technological change, these are good things, and they are good, and increasing productivity, these are good things. They make us richer and more prosperous collectively. But the way to mitigate, the way to deal with the unacceptable consequences in terms of income inequality, and hence inequality in people's outcomes, how people actually can take advantage of this, what ought to be wonderful technological change, is to redistribute income through the tax and benefit system. And we really did try quite hard to do that. The 2000 saw the most sustained attempt to try and redistribute income through the tax and benefit system, through tax credits, that really this country has ever seen. And it did achieve a lot. Child poverty fell. I was director of child poverty among my other jobs at the Department of Work and Pensions. Child poverty fell very substantially. That did make a difference. But ultimately, for various reasons, it proved to be politically, or in political economy terms, it just was, on the one hand, insufficient, and on the other hand, unsustainable. Politically unsustainable. We ran out of road in terms of what we could do through the tax and benefit system, and ultimately, of course, the combination of the financial crisis, austerity, and more general political developments meant that it was that those advances in redistributing income have, to a large extent, been reversed. And I think the really disappointing thing to those of us who were part of that was how easy politically they turned out to be to reverse. And no doubt others will say more about the political economy of UBS. So I think that has got many of those, and I was a civil servant, I'm not a Blairite in any sense, but I was very much felt personally committed to this agenda of redistributing through income. And I think we recognized that, not that we got it wrong, I still think everything we did in that respect was the right thing to do, but that it was not enough. That in order to genuinely combat inequality in a sustainable and lasting way, you needed to transform the way that the state delivered public services as well. And so I think it was that attracted me to this project when Andrew introduced me to it, and to try and think about, well, when we were, when Beveridge and others were thinking about what does a welfare state look like, what ought the state to provide, what do you do to combat the five giants that the welfare state was designed to combat, what sort of services were necessary, trying to rethink that. What is the justification, both economically and politically, for the state provision of public services now, and what, therefore, given where we are now, do we think we ought to provide? We still think that, I think with good reason, that health and compulsory education are services that ought to be provided by the state free at the point of use. But what other services are particularly important? And this actually, I'm not going to be trying to be too political, because I had a slight sort of disagreement with some of the sort of thrust of the Labour approach to nationalisation, in that, I mean, if you're going to talk about the commanding heights of the economy and talking about, bringing them into public ownership in some sense, then, there are perfectly good reasons for renationalising water, mostly related to how badly privatisation and regulation have worked out. But frankly, I don't see why we should really care that much beyond, that you might think that you could perhaps do it somewhat more efficiently or with less of a rip-off in the public sector. Well, fine, but it's not sort of fundamental, because it is not part of the commanding heights of the economy in any meaningful sense now. And so I think looking at that, trying to, well, what is it that what is it that we want to provide in order to make a society where, whether you call it socialist or social democratic or progressive or simply the society we want to live in, where everyone can fulfill their own potential, can take advantage of these opportunities that technological progress offers us. And things have really changed since Beveridge. And this is why I think that the free, whatever you think of the details of the free broadband proposal, that it is intellectually interesting. Nobody, quite rightly, 20 or 25 years ago, would have described a smartphone and access to the internet as a necessity, as something that you needed to participate in society. But it is now. You cannot get a job. You certainly cannot have a meaningful career if you do not have access to information and technology services, which means, given where we are now technologically, access to the smartphone and the internet. Who knows what it will be in 5 years? It may be something somewhat different. But certainly access to that, those network effects are things that you require to be able to participate, to take advantage. Similarly, with local transport services, interesting, something, of course, which actually the government that we just elected has obviously recognized in terms of one of its first actual meaningful spending commitments being towards improving the provision and affordability of local bus services. So this is not something that you need to be dreaming about a Marxist utopia. It simply recognizes the way that the way that our current economy and society functions. And I think it is that underlies the sort of thinking. And I think, rather than focusing necessarily on specific services in taking this agenda forward, I think John said quite right. It's not about a shopping list. It's not about or rewarding coaches. It's not about freebies. It's about trying to think what are given in the 2010s and the 2020s and the 2030s. What are the sort of things that we think everybody in our society ought to be able to have access to if they are to have the opportunity to live a fulfilling, a productive, to play a role in our society, to feel part of our society? What do we need to ensure that everybody has access to? That is what Beveridge was thinking about in the 1940s. That was what the post-war Labour government was trying to do. We need to step back and think, well, what is it that we need to do to make that a reality now? And I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Let me introduce Apsana Begum, who's one of my new colleagues, which is wonderful. She's newly elected MP for Poplar and Limehouse. That's great, isn't it? let me do it, embarrass her with a biopic. So, having grown up in a council estate in Shadwell, Apsana has inspired the East End's rich history of political activism and community organising. She's previously worked in public and voluntary sectors, a variety of roles, including as an equalities and diversity practitioner. She's committed to supporting a new kind of politics, building trust and empowerment among the ethnically diverse working class and supporting a new generation of activists. Apsana sits on the Labour Party's regional board. She's a member of Momentum's National Coordinating Committee. She's got a bit of form here, haven't you, Apsana? She's been an active trade unionist and prominent anti-austerity committee organiser. She's the first British Bangladeshi woman elected as Secretary of the Tower Hamlets Labour Party, is now the first hijab-wearing MP. Apsana's making her impression in Parliament already in terms of the work that she's doing. Apsana.
Thank you, and thank you, John. And I'm going to embarrass you now a little bit as well by actually beginning by paying tribute to your work as Shadow Chancellor. Chancellors and Shadow Chancellors actually are usually seen as the politicians that keep a lid on the big ideas back and kind of say no to things. And they're the ones that actually kind of say that something is either too ambitious or unaffordable. But John, over the last 4 years and over your whole kind of political career, you've created and supported big ideas. So you've been kind of behind the bold thinking around the Green New Deal. You've brought your experience and knowledge from fighting against austerity, your lifetime fighting for trade union rights and fighting against war and oppression, all into the Shadow Treasury. But I think more than that, I think what's been really important over your political career, especially in the last 4 years, is your commitment to opening out policy discussions and engaging with people beyond the traditional kind of political framework. And I think that's what really kind of marks you out for me. And actually just kind of thinking, I mean, as you kind of progress onto your elderly statesman kind of role, as you say, one of the things that I remember is that I attended one of the town seminars in Chingford, and it was really impressive to see, John as Shadow Chancellor actually sitting down and just engaging with people in the local area and talking about, what affects the local area and how kind of we can come together to kind of bring about ideas and policy proposals. And similarly, kind of this seminar series is a testament, I guess, to the creativity and depth of the socialist ideas that John's brought about into the mainstream. So, I mean, I think overall, we've not really had a chancellor or a shadow chancellor that's done that. So, particularly from Popular Limehouse, I'd say, we noticed that and we thank you for that. So tonight I want to speak about 2 campaigns that I've worked on. One which was on children's nurseries and one on community language services. And we didn't really talk about them as universal basic services, but that is actually one of the points that I want to make here tonight. We have some free services that I think we take for granted. Maybe it's useful to think of them as universal basic services, so that we make people aware that they are essential services, essential to our lives. And we have to kind of let people know that they are universal. So from talking about these 2 campaigns, I hope I can kind of add a few points in terms of what's been said by others and what's going to be said by others. Universal basic services are things that kind of we have to fight for, and they're often delivered locally. And they are actually services that are often kind of, we see right now, under attack. In terms of funding, including, I'm afraid to say, kind of local labour councils who are being forced to kind of operate in an impossible kind of funding framework. So I guess, in a lot of ways, it's about, it kind of demonstrates the fact that we need to be very clear about our principles and clear about when our principles are also being undermined. So 2 years ago, and there's some slides that that will probably kind of demonstrate some of the work here. So 2 years ago, I was involved in a campaign to stop the privatisation of nurseries in East London. Now the nurseries in question were actually run largely by ethnic minority women, BAME women, who were trained to educate children, particularly children who had complex needs. Sadly, they've now been handed over to the private sector, and so this is essentially a core service that's been handed over to the market and is now sort of, demonstrates how profit is kind of prioritised over people. And so many now will take on the childcare themselves and are kind of taking on the childcare themselves. They've been looking out across different boroughs to look at services that they can kind of put the children on, and really long sort of waiting lists. And also kind of relying on friends and family networks as well, so that's an added strain. And this is in an area we're talking about Poplar and Limehouse, which has one of the highest levels of child poverty in the entire country, and is also faced, with the effects of the national care crisis as well. So we brought together a group of activists, largely women, and campaigned through petitions, protests, social media engagements with the council leadership as well. We took the campaign to the Labour Party Women's Conference and also the National Conference as well. And we linked up with campaigns across the country. So in Salford, Becky Long Bailey's done a lot of work supporting the campaign there. It was a really incredibly kind of dynamic and creative campaign. And we sort of built a lot of community solidarity around the campaign as well. And really brought together people that had not necessarily been political activists or political campaigners before. So really demonstrated what can happen when kind of people come together. And the underpinning kind of feeling and strength of feeling was around that shared kind of belief that education for early years and support for early years is just far too important to be left to the market. So we're continuing to fight for our services. This Friday, Tower Hamlets' Send campaign, we're taking our banners, our massive invoice for £12 million, and a lot of energy and determination to Downing Street to demand more funding for services. And in East London itself, there's a proud history of campaigning and children's services being free at the point of use. Which we kind of highlighted a lot in our campaign. So, we talked about how the East London Federation of Suffragettes turned a local pub in my neighbouring constituency in Bethnal Green and Bow into a creche in 1915. The pub had been called the Gunmaker's Arms. So Sylvia Pankhurst and others, mainly sort of working class women, refurbished the building, opened it up as a mother and baby clinic with a free milk depot and a day nursery. It changed its name from the Gunmaker's Arms to the Mother's Arms. And they operated for about 6 years. And they were praised by the government and the media at the time. And I've got a quote here from a visitor who wrote in July 1915, "The children who are brought in the morning to stay have a grand, spacious, light and airy nursery, everything scrupulously clean." But we do know that we don't have free childcare today, and we're far from having a free milk depot. And the government's free childcare is only available to children whose parents work, so it covers kind of 40% of 2-year-olds, and there's no new funding that's been pledged in the Tory manifesto. And if we look at what we were proposing as Labour at the last election was no means testing, and we would have essentially established children's services as a universal basic service. And of course, that would have honoured the legacy of those activists that set up the Mother's Arms over 100 years ago. And the second campaign that I've worked on is the community languages services. So in a lot of academic writing, it's not a service that necessarily is kind of talked about or discussed. This is, again, a service that's delivered locally. In some parts of the country where there is this service, it's kind of delivered as part of education services or youth services. And in Tower Hamlets, where I grew up, the community languages service was a huge part of my life and the life of a lot of people around me. It's a service that provides languages support, so in Bengali, Urdu, Spanish, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali and other languages, and we have such a huge amount of language diversity in an area like mine. And one of the things that it does, it helps a lot of young people with school qualifications like GCSEs and really boosts their educational attainment. But it does do a lot more. I mean, it was how I learned Bengali, and when somebody learns their community languages or language, they understand their community better and they understand their elders better, and it fosters a lot of relationships and communication between two sets of generations. And it is actually a hugely important service for social cohesion across communities. But I would say, I mean, you're looking at we're at a time where people are worried about knife crime, we're worried about radicalisation, and a lack of sense of kind of belonging for young people. And we're in a situation where now these services are also being cut and privatised. So as of last week, this service has been outsourced, is being outsourced by a Labour council, which is looking to reduce fees. And according to the policy proposal around this, The argument is that there's such a strong argument that such a parental contribution towards this sort of education is there to support engagement and commitment. So that's essentially a direct kind of attack on the notion of universalism, and of course it will prevent a cross-section of the community from taking part. And it will prevent, I guess, the solidarity that universal basic services can secure as well. And it is no secret that I guess my constituency is on the front line of Tory austerity, and local government and vital services have been undermined, obviously, by the Tory cuts, leading to the loss of key services. But I do think that it's really important that we fight for these services to be protected in statute. And it is because I believe that because these services are not protected and are non-statutory, that they are so easily privatised. So we need to build a movement that can defend these services and ensure they're enjoyed across the country. And I think a movement that will ensure these services are truly universal. And just kind of reflecting in terms of the Labour manifesto in 2019, I mean, I saw young activists, door knockers, people that I'd kind of spoken to, really inspired by the level of ambition in our manifesto. It didn't just protect the free services that we already have, it did want to extend the services we should have access to. And things like, hospital car parking and dental care really did actually resonate with the ordinary person on the doorstep. I've obviously already mentioned children's services, but we, in social care, for example, no, that's been mentioned a lot as well. It addressed the crisis we have by pledging free personal social care. Again, this is something at a local level that we used to have in Tower Hamlets that was free. So for me, it doesn't sound like it was a huge, just a huge big wish list. It actually, to me, sounded like it was a foundation for a decent life that everybody should have. And I guess my only explanation for why I think some people doubted some of these pledges is that, with 10 years of a Tory government and its effect on local government, it's just really, really drained and kind of left out so much hope and belief, and people have just become really hopeless in terms of politics. So I think, people, I think, far too often think they probably only deserve the most basic of the basic services, and I think that's kind of where we've ended up because of so much austerity and because of so much cuts to our services. But I do think, one of the things of the last 4 or 5 years was also the message from John and Jeremy and the team that, actually we deserve better than kind of what we're getting at the moment, and I think that was a really strong message as well in the last 4 years, and I don't think we should definitely give up on that or refuse to give up on that hope. And I do think that actually, this manifesto in 2019, I do think in years to come, people will reflect back and look back and think actually, this was a huge foundation for setting and developing a society that's free and fair and equal. So in terms of the challenges kind of ahead, I think we need to argue and fight and continue as socialists to kind of explain why everybody deserves the kind of services that I've kind of advocated for. And to explain why and how politics can deliver those services for people, because it has done before. And to explain why the Labour Party can deliver those services for people, because it has done before and it will again. But as I've explained, that takes a lot of kind of local campaigns, local campaigns kind of becoming national campaigns as well. And it might take some challenging conversations to get there, even within our own party. But it has been done before, and I think we're all up for it, and we should continue to work on this. So thank you.
Thanks, Apsana. Terrific. Gives you confidence, doesn't it? I tell you, the new MPs that have come in this time round, it's just sparkling. It really is. And you won't have seen many of them, but the ones that are coming forward at the moment, you just have confidence in the future. And I think it's at a different level of engagement as well, because most of them, like Apsana, have come in through local community campaigning, community organising. fought the battle to get selected, often in the difficult circumstances as well, and have come through all that. And this, I'm sorry, this isn't meant to be patronising, but actually extremely articulate and knowing where they've come from and where they want to go as well. And it's also that thing about the future and hope. Some time ago, someone said, is there any light at the end of the tunnel? And it was interesting. I was in a political discussion, and someone said, no, your eyes just become accustomed to the dark. And this generation isn't going to take that. They're not going to take it. There are people like Apsana and others who are not going to become accustomed to the dark. There is going to be light at the end of it. It's just encouraging. Right, our next speaker is Andrew Percy. Let me run through the blurb, Andrew, so get your lawyers ready. Is co-director of the Social Prosperity Network at the Institute for Global Prosperity, UCL. He leads the IGP's work on the 21st century welfare and was the lead author on the 2017 IGP report on universal basic services. Andrew's most recent book is The Case for Universal Basic Services, published by Polity Press, co-authored with Anna Coote of the New Economics Foundation. Andrew's worked in IT in the UK and USA since the early 80s. His CEO just works in California, in addition to some time teaching in Egypt, producing UK, I'm not going to say this. He's producing UK's first hip-hop album with Positive Beat Records and in finance. And today, when Politico were doing their roundup for the day, they mentioned the discussion tonight, the workshop, the whatever tonight, and they mentioned Andrew, but they got the wrong name, and they named him as a Tory MP. Now, Andrew sorted out the correction, but what was interesting, we were talking about it earlier, the Tory MP was desperately trying to get it corrected as well. Andrew.
Thanks very much, John. Yes, I suspect someone's headquarters was onto him about why he was coming to talk at John McDonnell's seminars on the future of Labour policy. I do want to say, first of all, a big thank you to John as well, because although we did the report and Jonathan was part of that team to produce universal basic services, it wouldn't have been if John hadn't picked it up, and it was barely had the report printed when John's office was saying, there's something here that we're really interested in, what can we do? And so I think that what was really exciting for me and for the team at the Institute for Global Prosperity was that 2019 was the first election that any party anywhere had run a campaign that had a universal basic services mindset. And I know John really doesn't like the term, and we tried out, I guess, universal public services, and I don't really mind what it's called at all, but I understand the struggle to find the right version of that in any particular political movement. So very exciting, and what we've had a little chance to do at the Institute for Global Prosperity is review how the Universal Basic Services proposal landed with the electorate in that election, and I'll give you my first kind of bits of feedback about what we thought we saw about how that arrived. And the first point, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the framing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the justification pieces. My first point would be that I think there was, and John talked about this in his introduction to tonight in the first place, so I don't think this is unrecognized, is that the larger framework was not in place. So when the individual policies arrived, people asked why. Why should I have that? Why should someone else have that? And they would then ask that individually about each policy as it arrived. And so I think that this is the first thing to take away as we develop this idea into the future. It has to fit into a larger narrative, and you have to present and win the argument for that narrative before the policies will make sense. Right? Ideally, in an election, you do not have time to explain policies to the electorate. When you announce them in your manifesto, they have to make sense automatically to people. They go, oh yeah, no, they're doing that because this is their sort of top line agenda of what they want to achieve. And so that's the first piece. And I'll talk a little bit about what, for me personally, the reason why universal basic services is that we have to prepare for change. That great changes are coming, as someone wrote the other day, that like waves on a beach, to signify that these are not waves that we created and they are not ones that we can stop. Whether they are climate change, which would be my number one, but also at aging societies and the impact of technology on the labor market that Jonathan has talked about. These are things that we are going to have to cope with as a society, and we can do it together. We can develop ways of transitioning, of supporting each other through these changes. But before we can work together, we have to remove the sense of insecurity that exists. Because I believe we are, and the Institute for Global Prosperity is founded by Henrietta Moore, who's an anthropologist, not an economist, and so it's quite funny that this report came out of an anthropology group at UCL. But the sort of anthropological piece would be that we react fairly predictably to circumstances. And when you are insecure and you see change coming, you tend to tighten up and you don't want to deal with it. And so that the purpose of these things is to try and create a society which is going to be more, at least accepting of change. I would go further. We need to embrace change. People need to feel enthusiastic about the changes we're all going to have to make to deal with these waves that are coming. So that is, I think, something like the narrative that needs to be established in the first place. And then behind that, there are some sort of reasonings behind that. So I would say that there are two big points that are part of universal basic services and into which people can then drop each of the individual policies. So the first one, I think, has already been talked about, which is access to basic necessities based on need, not ability to pay. It's something that we're very lucky in the UK that because of the NHS, this is a well understood concept, and extending that access to other additional necessities is the argument that we have to make and the fight, or as Jonathan said, Apsana said, whether we call it a fight or an explanation, but expanding that basic right of access, because that is a fairness. And I think that one of the things that's been very interesting that I've seen in the research that people have done going to the so-called ex-Red Wall, or whatever we call it, those constituencies, and asking people about the sorts of policies that are coming at them now from this government, that the most visceral reactions against things that they consider to be unfair. And I think that's something to really pick up in the access argument, that the reason why we're having universal basic services, you may not need it right now, but you could fall on hard circumstances, someone else has fallen on hard circumstances. It's fair that they should have right of access to get on a bus, to get to the doctor, to get on the internet, to talk to their, virtually every single service that you have to deal with. So there's a fairness of access argument to universal basic services, but there's also a cost of living argument. And I think that this is where I will come on to, in a minute, into the justification piece. But I think if you put those two things into the universal basic services framework, that they are the things that allow people to drop then the individual policy. Oh, so the internet, access to the internet, yes, it's a necessity and everybody needs it. What's the impact on me? I already have internet. Well, actually, we're replacing cost. This is the social wage argument. And therefore, my costs are going down. Now I can do something else with that money. And so you are giving agency, effectively, as part of that argument. I do think that as national policy, universal basic services is difficult. And Apsana's talked about this, and it's come up, and funnily enough, it's right here in the, on the page 3 of the little piece of paper, if you picked it up as you walked in. And that is that the nature of a lot of these services is that they're local. And therefore, how do you, create a meaningful national policy when the implementation, so if that's all those other bits are the why, and we now get to the how, right? The how is quite difficult to do, and in many of these cases, if you talk about care services or food services, or even if you're talking about housing, I mean, it's absolutely vital that we have social housing builds in this country, right? But it's a minority of people that are going to be in social housing at the moment. So we have to accept that there are all of these varieties. And one of the things that, to plug the book, but if you get this and read it, what you'll find, and mostly from Anna's experience and expertise, I would say, rather than mine, is that in each universal basic services, the conditions and the requirements for that particular service are different than the other services. That what universal basic services does, or universal public services, or whatever you want to call it, is it provides that overarching narrative for what are, in fact, quite a disparate set of subsequent policies underneath. And they are necessarily that way, because in each service area, you have to do it specifically to that. So I think that getting into the how of a particular universal basic service, when you're talking about national policy, is very difficult. And therefore, the argument needs to be something more like, we want to do this, everybody has a right of access to this kind of thing. And what we're going to do as a national government is we're going to collect the money that's necessary to do that, and then we're going to push that money down to the lowest level we can, to communities, to cities, to regions, to subnations, whatever it is, at another level. You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to have in a national policy, this is exactly how we're going to do it. We're going to take the money and we're going to push it down the devolution scale. Now, we need vibrant local democracies, and that's another part of the argument. So the one other thing that I will talk about is the justification piece that, and to give John and his crew credit, it came, and there was a part of the election period in which this did surface, but it got, in my opinion, a bit mixed up. So here's what I'm trying to talk about. This second portion, so everybody has access, and at the moment, we're working with Camden Council on developing little mini universal basic services pilots in Camden. And we're looking, first of all, at information and transport. Now, when you look at the information one, you look at the cohort of people that we're proposing to put into the pilot scheme, most of them already have internet access. This isn't about access for them. They have access. What this is about is the displacement of cost, the social wage value. It's about what else they can do with the money that they won't now have to spend on the telephone company. And that is a really important part of this argument, that it needs to come with the rest of it. And I would, if I was in charge of John's office or any other part of the Labour Party here, I would say, start on a program that looks something like this now, and start the education process. Have a set of households. And there are people like Loughborough University and the minimum income standard. There are independent people out there who have done great work on what it costs to live a minimum life. And this is not something that some university professor has decided is a minimum life. It's not a political. They go out and they survey people and they say, what do you think people who live around you and in your community should have access to as a minimum? And then they go and cost those things. So it's a really nice independent framework that you can take, and then you can put it in a table, because they'll tell you there exactly what they spend on transport, what they spend on information, what they spend on childcare, what they spend on all of these different categories, and you can just have a nice simple table. So for the average student who spends an enormous amount, you'd be surprised, on transport, this would be the effect for that kind of household. And if you could simplify this, maybe just have 4 different kinds of households, something, but then once a quarter, you can push this back out and say, in today's environment, at today's costs, and probably we're going to find that the commercial cost in the marketplace of basic services is going to go up if they get increasingly privatized. Things that were free are going to start to cost money. That this argument will just get stronger and stronger over time. But when you get to the next election, you would hope that this isn't something you have to start from ground zero. That you are starting to say, people understand the concept of a social wage. They understand that the point of doing these services is not just to get people access because people don't have access. And they won't say to free broadband, why do I need free broadband? I've got plenty of broadband. What they'll say is, oh, I understand. What we're doing is we're liberating money in people's pockets so that they can do other things that give them greater agency and more control in their lives. than just paying for the telephone company. So I think I'll stop there. That's my summary of what I think we would take as learnings from 2019. But thanks again to John for even making that possible.
Okay, shall we throw it up to questions and comments?
So if you're concerned about the branding of universal basic services, I've been trying to plough through Guy Standing's book on the plunder of the commons. So maybe if you reframe this in terms of commons that people have had things taken away from them, this may be a better way of approaching the argument rather than giving away freebies.
I was coming with two things in my mind, which are coming right from another point of view, which is actually social problems we've got, and the kind of frustration of actually freshly saying why it was we're doing things. I mean, for example, when the Tories are saying people are wanting to live in the past. I was born in 1942, so it was but I remember the early years and a feeling that it was experimenting, but this sense of there was a different sense about the welfare state, and there were mistakes, but it was being made and people had a pride in it. But what I'm saying is, it's the Tories who are living in the past. They have returned us to the Victorian days of the deserving and the undeserving poor. And that is a cruelty. They are the ones who are living in the past. And how does one... And then the other one is that social problems. I mean, I worked my background was in the personal social services, where you at LSE, we did start with the problems. I mean, there were many aspects to it, the social, the economic, all of those things, and a wonderful training we had in the 60s at the Undergraduate College. The other thing was hearing Naomi Klein, who came in October or November, a book, I don't know what it was, but it was about the world being aflame now and Australia being aflame, and talking about the new Green New Deal. But she was saying, and the ideas in America, but she says, but the Labour have this idea of it, and that's why they are recommending nationalising energy and transport, because if you don't nationalise energy and transport, you won't have an initiative and an integrated capacity to bring down the emissions. Now, that's the end point and the purpose of them, and I think the purposes are far more immediate. Some of these things can feel too long-term. There are pressing, immediate problems we've got. How do you think long-term and radically about things?
Pass it on after me. Okay, so this is going to sound more cynical than I want it to. You know, I listened to you all, and I'm like, yay, yes. And I loved your plan and everything like that. I guess my question is, and maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like we're living in a society, not just in this country, but also in a world where people don't really care about other people anymore. So this sounds great in this room, but if I'm going to go out and take it to the population at large, and I've campaigned a lot, I do feel like we're living with people that are just like, what's in it for me? What's in it for me? So when you're saying, okay, we think people deserve X, Y, Z, I totally agree with you, but my question is, how do I communicate that to the electorate that is more like, well, I only care about this, that's it.
I think when we talk about universal basic services, I think it needs to be something a bit more fundamental than things like transport. It needs to be things like food. I work with a project called Streets Kitchen, and on Friday and Saturday evenings we have queues of people queuing up for free food who are homeless. And someone on the panel said that social housing is only required by a minority of the population, but we have disabled people waiting 5 weeks to receive money from Universal Credit. I'm sure that that everyone on the panel would agree that Universal Credit is not fit for purpose. So we need a decent welfare system, because I feel that we have gone back to the Victorian era where the community provided for itself. But one of the things that really struck me as far as learning the lessons of the general election, one of the things that struck me is one woman saying, I voted for the Conservatives because they said, the Labour said they were going to take away food banks and I need my food bank. So this is someone who can only see in the dark. This is someone who may be quite young and probably doesn't remember what life was like before food banks and thinks that, oh, Labour's going to be even worse because they're going to take the food bank away. So we really, that's kind of we've fallen so far back in that respect. And I think that the panel need to kind of be aware that people are killing themselves. Universal credit is driving people to suicide. And the DWP have been I know John knows because he's our strongest advocate. But, might be people in this room that don't know that the DWP with their kind of wait times and their delays and their possibly deliberate mistakes have cost the lives of over 130,000 people since 2010. It's probably a lot more than that. Disabled people and homeless people and poor people are the people who would first and foremost benefit from universal basic services. Forget about broadband. People need to eat.
Take one more and I'll bring the panel back in.
Hi. I've got two questions, but very quick. One thing, I was just thinking about branding also, about Andrew Yang's campaign in the US of universal basic income and how they called it a freedom dividend. I don't know if that's better advertising, but I also thought that when you're talking about devolution and getting it to the local level, how far should we go and should we go to universal basic income and should we go to the individual level, or what's the argument against that? And secondly, I think someone at the beginning was talking about Thatcherism and financialization, and I was interested in it, but I do fear that because of the global economy nowadays and the worries about capital flight, that if we do nationalize a lot of industry, that could be a problem. I'm not sure.
So there's a great deal of linkage between the Commons movement and universal basic services. I'm going to leave the branding decisions to politicians, I think, at this point. Ownership is important. It is a vital component of how these services end up rolling out. But I would say, again, that this is the how, and we have to win the why argument first, which goes to the next question, which is why. And if people don't care, and what you find is that people don't care, then there's, that's a sad indictment of a certain group of people. However, there are, as I would say that there is additional mileage in pointing out these changes that are coming, which are beyond the capacity of individuals to handle for themselves. So that is one of the lines of argument that I certainly find is useful in terms of getting people to think more broadly outside of themselves. We don't take it all the way down to individuals because individuals can't build hospitals, individuals don't build buses. These are community-based services that are necessarily social capital that we can only build when we work together. So that's where I would do that. Food. I love food. I love food as a universal basic service. It's one of the most difficult. It requires the most local. You will find on our website at ubs-hub.org where we've worked with local food kitchens that may be doing very similar work to you. And so I absolutely think food is a universal basic service. It was included very deliberately and with some difficulty in our original report. But it is one that generates the most controversy, I would say, and it needs to be well thought out and well argued.
Two things really. I think the first thing is what you said about kind of people don't care about others anymore. I think again that kind of is a symptom of the amount of austerity, the amount of cuts, and the impact of the Tory government, and people becoming, I guess, in some ways insular and thinking about themselves. But I think that's a symptom of what's happened over the last decade. But I don't think. I think people may be kind of feeling a little bit like that, but we've got to acknowledge, I guess some of us can acknowledge really that that's as a result of all of these different things. And I don't think people need to see those messages of hope. People need to see what is actually possible. And it was similar in a lot of ways to 2015 when, those messages came, actually things can be done differently, politics can be done differently. And we need to go back to that, and I think people will start to kind of think as well. It's some of the things that will come maybe through policy directions coming forward in the next few years in the party. People might actually realise actually the things that were actually promised in this manifesto made sense and make sense and will make sense going forward. One thing I would say in terms of branding, I mean, we talk about universal basic services, is that the right term? A lot of things around political communication we can speak about, but I don't think there's like one right way of doing things and one right way of talking about things. You change this universal basic services like that term to something else, it will become too complex for people to understand, or this is too simplistic, we've got to be more more sophisticated about it, or this is too sophisticated, we need to be more simple about it. So I don't think there's really one right way around that. And actually I think universal basic services as a term for this actually makes a lot of sense and a lot of people understand it.
Thanks. So lots of points there. On the people don't care point, I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. There's the British social attitude. They voted. Well,
Talking to people generally in life, it is true. It is true.
I think it is true.
If you ask people whether they want to pay more tax and have higher public spending, then those numbers have gone up quite a bit over the last 5 years, and that's that's something I've seen a lot of in my 35 years of doing this stuff. Back to when I started doing social security policy in the Treasury in 1987. That there is actually a pendulum here. When cuts go too far, people react against them, and that's what we've seen. People do actually. There is the public mood, and you can see this in it's the British Social Attitude Survey, which is the gold standard for this, and you can see this over 30 years, that people 5 years, at the latter end of the Blair government in the first couple of years of this government thought that the country was spending, whether or not you agree with this, and I know, country was spending too much, that unemployed people were getting too much, that public spending needed to be cut. That has swung back again, the other way. Now people want more public spending, they're prepared to pay somewhat higher taxes. That's what the evidence says. And actually, like it or not, you're seeing some of that in this government. This government is going to introduce next week a fiscal rule, and John and I know this because we've been working on this sometimes together for the last few years. That this government will introduce a new fiscal rule which will allow more public spending and more borrowing in particular than the rule which Simon Wren-Lewis and I came up with and which John and co largely adopted. That's because they recognize that there isn't actually any more mileage for austerity. So I don't think that it's quite true to say that. What I think is more of a fundamental challenge, and this is something that I think about a lot in the context of what I spend most of my time on immigration, is that people really care a lot about fairness. But people in this room probably have a very different conception about what fairness means to a lot of people out there. And so trying to win that argument and make the case for why this approach is fair, why it's fair to people, to tax them and then spend money on services that they will or won't, may or may not use, and that people who they may or may not think are deserving, in the words of somebody else in this room, that is an important word and a difficult one. I haven't got time to say how you win that argument, and to be honest, I don't know how to win that argument. But that is actually the really difficult thing. You don't, and just taking a sort of defeatist view and saying, people don't think the way we do, I don't think is the right way of thinking. It's how you shape a narrative around fairness that goes in the direction you want it to go. Just on money versus services. This is an important set of issues, and it also relates actually to the food and housing one. They are not, in my view, they are complementary. You do need a welfare state that provides a basic level of financial support for people out of work, for disabled people, for people in low-paid work. While Andrew, as you said, food is part of the universal basic services, but the reasons why people are going to food banks now are actually, and why they weren't 10 years ago, are not because the British food distribution services cracked up or because we privatized food. It was never public after all. They are, as you said, because of the benefit system. It's because of universal credit. And actually, if you want to solve those problems, you have to solve the benefit system, which is partly about the way universal credit is operating at the moment, and partly just about money, actually, and the levels of benefit payments. That's not quite true to the same way in housing, but it's a lot of the case. I mean, we did more or less eliminate street homelessness in the 2000s by the judicious applications of money from the centre and local initiatives. These things can be done, and actually, back to the fairness point, most people want them to be done. Most people think street homelessness is bloody awful. They don't think that is fair. They don't think it is right. And you can make and win an argument that is around that. But back on the point, so I think, you need quite a careful distinction between ensuring that you are putting enough money in people's pockets to enable them to have the potential to live with others, and providing services which can and should be provided collectively. And trying to get that balance right is part of the wider agenda behind this.
Just do another round.
Yeah, I'd first like to make a comment on what this lady brought up about the caring side, because I actually go back to, I think there's a fundamental change has happened in this country since the 1980s. And what I observed, and maybe some others did, is that since Margaret Thatcher's time, the values of this country, the culture of this country has phenomenally changed. So much so that some people, I know what you said about you don't think people have that lack of caring, but I actually think it's generated and cascaded through generations to some extent, and we're having to deal with some of that now. So I don't think it's just the austerity that you mentioned. I don't think it's just that. I think this goes back a lot further. So I just wanted to say that there is an element, certainly in my mind, where people aren't caring and do not think sometimes it's fair, depending on how they perceive things as well. So that's just the first thing I'd like to say. The other thing about the universal basic services, I thought about this quite a bit and looked at the income things that some others have mentioned. And I think it's the how bit that is challenging. I think some of the policies were also going to be challenging about how do we actually do them. Because I think if we don't think those things through and can't answer them and can't implement them, why are we actually suggesting them? So I think there needs to be a lot more work done on the how side of things. The other thing about this universal basic services for me is, I guess all of us in this room could have a difference of opinion about what are the basic services. NHS, education, we could also, I guess, grasp some of them. We've heard others argued is something else as well. And I thought, well, where's the starting point for all of this? Is it food? Is it water? For those who are sad like me and studied motivation theory and Maslow and about hierarchy of needs, basic physiological needs, food, water, security, warmth, all those things. That's maybe a starting point, but how do we develop it into something else? And then the next question many people will ask, how do we finance all this? John's had all this asked to him on TV many times about all of this stuff. How do we finance this stuff? Because it has to be looked at. It has to be considered. And if we can't actually say how we're going to do this and finance it, we're not going to win any arguments. One of the things about this is if we don't get that right, we are going to be out of power for a long, long time. We've had a warning. I've seen a massive wave starting at the top of Scotland over the years, and it's come down, and we've lost Scotland except for one guy, and it's now penetrated at the north and some of the Midlands. And I do think there's a big lesson to be learned. That's for another debate, I know, but thank you.
Thank you.
Very
Very close.
I'd like to ask, why have we become accepting of the working poor? Now, the Americans on the panel would know all about that. Why is it that 2 salaries cannot keep a family? There's something fundamentally wrong there. There shouldn't need to be subsidized housing, subsidized transport and schooling. It should actually fit into your salary. When I see people interviewed from France or Germany, people get a salary because they're working full time and they live on their salary. Their rent is proportionate to their salary, their transport, everything fits into the salary. Here somehow we have accepted that there are working poor and they shouldn't be there.
Thank you. Hi. I just wanted to pick up on some of the sort of culture points that have been made about caring. And I wondered, did the panel have any thoughts about using the universalized services that we already have as a ratchet to address that? It seemed like from the initial comments that the idea was that we needed to win the why argument first. And I wondered, is that looking at it maybe, or is there scope to look at it the other way around and to think about, we already have some universal services, can those be used as sort of solidarity building mechanisms to lead people to think of themselves more as collectives, to undo some of the cultural work that was referred to earlier that came about in the Thatcher era of individualizing people. So I'd just be interested to hear what the panel think about how we could use what we already have to rebuild an argument for extending that to these other areas where we need these kinds of services to be addressed.
I just have a point to make about fairness. I think it's probably the most important thing in all of this. And the point about it being universal. I just wondered, how do you square that with it then coming down to be filtered through devolved processes? How do you make it universal while still maintaining a local focus? Thank you.
Sorry, I've forgotten your name on the end here, but you mentioned about change coming. Sorry. Change coming. People don't believe in change until it happens. They don't believe in change until it happens and it's too late. And I'd like your opinion on that. And also, everything that we're agreed on in this room are things that work against the corporations who are working under the neoliberal system that we're under. And nobody's mentioning this. And since the election, this has been the big elephant in the room that nobody's talking about. How on earth are we going to ever get to the point where we can get into government with the system we're under that is run by corporations? We need to have this conversation, and nobody's been talking about it since December the 12th. And I'm at the point of leaving the party. I was doing a lot of work. Like you, I've done a lot of campaigning. I was vice chair of my CLP. I have worked hard. We really believed that we were going to change things. We have to have the conversation that we're not allowed to put a socialist system into this country as things stand. We are not allowed to. And we can do all this academic talking forever and ever and ever, and it will never ever change anything. And I feel so strongly about that. Nobody's been talking about it.
Oh.
Don't leave the party until you come to our seminar on the 24th of March, which is about securing a socialist Labour government, what we're up against. Well, promise me you're not going to leave until at least then.
There was one last question in that I know people have different experiences over the last period, but some of the pictures that people are painting I don't recognise. Please come to Tower Hamlets and Poplar Limehouse. People really care about the services and that is why you should have been outside the town hall on Wednesday when people were out in the cold campaigning for it, and the thing about caring about something else. So I was a local constituent of Apsana now, but I've known her for a long time, and we've been involved in campaigning on the issues that she was outlining, and I don't have children, I won't need nursery services, I don't speak another language, I won't need a community language services, and yet locally, because there was people built a vibrant campaign which I became a part of. So I don't really, obviously I know that it is the case, and it's not saying that, but it's just to put out that there are actually lots of people care. And one thing that I wanted to add to that was, why do you think that some of these services that are being cut are no longer perceived to be universal basic services? Is it the fact that the need is no longer there? Or is it the fact that you no longer want to afford, you no longer want to pay for them? And isn't that then sort of a contradiction? Because are they a service because they're affordable or for the state, or are they a service because you need them? So I'm talking about tuition fees, we're talking about local services. Our social care and nurseries, we've had loads and loads of cuts. Is it the fact that they're now no longer a universal service that is needed?
Okay. If I bring the panel in for the final session, okay now? Apsana, do you want to go first?
I'm just going to say one thing, really. I mean, yes, I agree with you to some degree. What the lady over there said about, people. Why we're not talking about neoliberalism, why we're not talking about the neoliberal consensus, which we were talking about all these years. What happened in December and why we stopped talking about. I don't think, Mary's kind of covered that point already. I don't think people have stopped having those conversations. People are not talking about it. I think when also we have, now we've got, our a threat to our right to strike and those kind of things, that's actually galvanizing a lot of people. And that's actually bringing a lot of people together. So when our fundamental kind of rights are kind of being threatened, which is going to unfortunately happen more and more, I think we will kind of probably see maybe a kind of a reborn kind of socialism and a socialist movement coming forward. So don't leave the party just yet.
Why not introduce a little bit of controversy here? I think the point about the neoliberal consensus is bullshit, frankly. I was, without doubt, part of the neoliberal consensus myself. I joined the Treasury in 1987 under Thatcher. I worked there until 2011 under Cameron when I left. There certainly was a broad, a consensus, not about the goals, because there was a huge shift in redistribution, as I've already mentioned, but certainly about how the economy worked and broadly how markets worked. And you can call that, if you want to call that a neoliberal consensus, fine. But that got exploded, whether or not we fully realized it at the time in 2008-9. And everything that's happened since has made it, so I no longer believe in it, and a lot of the people who I work with no longer believe in it as a way of thinking about how the economy works, let alone how it should work. And that's why you have new ideas like this coming up on the left, center-left, and equally you have some new ideas coming up on the right, whether you like them or not, but which are certainly not neoliberal. And the idea, frankly, that this government, which is about to set out a negotiating mandate for the Brexit negotiations, which prioritize our right to do our own thing over any prospect of continued relatively low friction trade with Europe. The idea that that government is doing the bidding of big corporations or the CBI in pursuing that agenda is total fantasy. It's clearly not. I talk to these people. This is, what the government is doing with Brexit is not, whether you like it or not, is a very, very long way from neoliberalism, because they have a very, it's not a neoliberal government. It may not be a government you like, but it's not a neoliberal one. That's because the consensus that people like I thought was relatively stable was exploded, and we are now trying to struggle to work out from various different perspectives what comes next, and it's really hard. Perhaps I should stop there.
We may not all agree with you.
I'm glad an economist finds it hard, because I found it bloody hard.
He's only worried about what this government's about to do.
I'm not saying you shouldn't be. I'm just saying the idea that there's some consensus that has been around for a long time and is still there is just clearly not true.
There was a good piece by Tom. There was a good piece in the Guardian by Tom Cabassa, which I thought was really amusing, where he said that that expression that Tony Blair was Thatcher's major achievement. That was one of the slides they put on, and he said actually Dominic Cummings is John McDonnell's major achievement.
Thanks, John.
Whatever you think of Dominic, he's not a neoliberal.
There's quite a lot to pick up there. I'm going to try and loop some of them in together and talk and pick up particularly on the question from the end there, which was how do you do devolved provisioning and national policy, and how does all of this fit together? Partly on the question of how do you finance this? One of the sort of first objectives in our initial report was to demonstrate that while this does cost money, we are not talking about budget-busting numbers. So you have to raise some tax, is I think the short version, or we cut their personal allowance. How you do the distributed provision inside this system is you create what I would call a basic entitlement. And then you do have to think of a way of phrasing that. So you might say that we are going to have an entitlement where everybody can have 30 minutes, 30 texts, and 30 megabytes a day. And that's the information service. And that you can broadly cost that across the country, and then you can take that money and give it down as far as you can, that there is a democratically responsive organization. And they can do it. And you will find that in some community on the edge of Cornwall, that actually their own private local ISP that they built themselves, that's run the cables through the streets, is the best way to do it there. And it's something completely different outside this building. So you can define entitlements, and then you can push the money down to enable people to do that individually or in their local areas. There may not be a complete solution, but I hope that addresses something in the room about how to do that. Jonathan would be the one to talk about how the idea that there's working poor. The answer, of course, is you have to go both ways.
I guess my perspective on that very briefly is that, given the way the economy functions now and for the foreseeable future, the idea that you are going to get that you are going to be able to lift people out of poverty when they have families and children without having some form of income support for people who are still in work is not going to happen.
They pay proper salaries like other parts of the world.
Do you know what?
We're subsidizing private.
Okay, so what sort of salary do you think you would need to pay someone, the head of a family of 4 in London, to get them out of poverty, as defined by, as Andrew says, the minimum income standards? It would be pretty close to the average salary in the UK now. Now that ain't going to happen. That does not add up. I'm not a great believer that we have some great financing constraint. As everyone knows, I'm quite in favor of borrowing a bit more. There's plenty of money in the economy. But the idea that's going to happen is a pure fantasy. Tax credits work. They do lift people out of poverty. If you don't want working poor people.
Sorry? It's the cost of living against the salaries that you're talking about.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that we are subsidizing the private sector, which we shouldn't be doing.
Yes.
So the salaries should be commensurate with the cost of living, and the services should be a safety net. So yes, school and kindergarten, there should be a lot more kindergartens, and the parents can work. But in other countries, not all of them. This is the Anglo-Saxon model. And in America, it works beautiful because the people with 2 salaries can't run a family. They're living in containers in the land of the free. Yes. Do we want to go that way? If we don't want to go that way, then, I've seen interviews with people like a minister in France saying, oh, but your minimum salary is too high. How do you expect business can't afford it? They said, well, if they can't afford it, they shouldn't be running a business. You pay a decent salary. Yes, you subsidize transport, schools, the basics, it's attached, but you shouldn't have to subsidize housing. There isn't a housing problem. We should make it illegal for people who don't live somewhere to buy a property, and then it wouldn't push all the costs up, and people who live there can afford to pay rent or buy or whatever it is. But, you know, we have to get things in. We're subsidizing the private sector.
I mean, sorry, I mean, just is not the case that tax credits are subsidizing the private sector, and the fact that the reason people are, you can see that simply by the fact that there are a lot of people who are a lot poorer than they were 5 or 10 years ago because tax credits have been cut. If you believe tax credits are a subsidy to the private sector, then you should be happy with what this government has done to them. And that is not something that I think...
Here's another way of looking at that I would argue, that I think that changes this around. I would argue that we get these out of proportion. The largest function is the human society within which we operate, and the corporations and business are a subset of that. I'll give you one example of how I think the equation works. If you take the NHS, they make decisions based on the quality of people's life and how long it's going to be and what it's going to affect them. If you were to add up this country, according to the NHS's standards, you would come up with a figure of GDP that was somewhere around 60 times, or it's either 30 or 60 times, it's massively larger than the actual GDP we have. In other words, the society is much bigger than the business sector. So when you talk about we subsidize business, everything we do subsidizes business. The education system, the NHS, the roads, it's all taxpayer funded. There isn't this distinction between, oh, but this bit is reducing their expenses, or we're going to introduce a set of laws which will force businesses to pay 25 grand a year or less. We are creating this society, and we get to set the rules. And so this idea about universal basic services is about pushing that set from our side. We don't have to force the corporations to do anything, but we can reduce the cost of living, and we can drive that down to a point where it will be more difficult to be working poor, even if they don't get paid more. That would be my perspective. But I think the main thing is to get this in proportion, right? We are the society, we live in a democracy, and we're lucky enough to do so. It is up to us. And in answer to one of the other questions, which was more like, and please don't give up, the answer is that in the face of these changes, in every human society, there has to be a level of leadership. That is how people deal with change. Do people want to not face change and therefore ignore it? Yes. But what are the successful models where that happens is people stand up and get counted and do things and organize campaigns. And that's what it takes. And hopefully, because you're in this room, you're part of that group and you can do more of it.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're going to wind up now. Let me just finish by saying this. On the interesting thing about the two manifestos, manifesto is only a statement of objectives with a range of policies that demonstrate how you can achieve those objectives. And you need to, as I said, you need to have a fairly strong narrative around that if you're going out to argue in the media, on the doorstep, or any form. But actually, the manifestos themselves, the reason I'm quite proud of them is that even though they're summary documents, they were quite comprehensive in how you could tackle individual problems and comprehensively societal problems as well. So this issue around income, it was about restoring some balance between the relationship and capital and labour. So the restoration of trade union rights and the restoration of sectoral collective bargaining, those issues, employment rights from day one, a real living wage, those sorts of things actually were quite important. But linked to that as well, particularly in some areas about the housing costs, it was about building social housing again, council housing again, but also the potential for rent controls in particular areas as well. And that then linked on to the discussion about what else do people need, those basic services that they need. So it was quite comprehensive and did link in. And on the point that you made, actually we did a costing exercise every time. And even though that was challenged by IFS, actually the challenges were, well, I was quite surprised at how mild-mannered they were in many ways. And I'll just we've got a debate tomorrow in advance of the budget, and we only have a limited time that we're given under this Parliament at the moment in terms of opposition day. So we thought what we'd do is talk about social care in particular and what we need, how that needs to be organised and how that should be a universal basic service for everyone. But also we're linking it to one of our proposals around taxation, which was about tackling tax avoidance and tax evasion. And we had a really detailed, comprehensive programme brought forward by Professor Prem Sikka, his corporate reform group, the Tax Justice Network, 40 different organisations working together. So actually it did weld together pretty well in terms of what was needed, how you implement them, and then how you fund them. So I'm quite pleased with that work, but of course, behind each one of those areas, thanks to the work done by people on this panel in particular, and many, many, many others, were individual detailed policies as well. So Jonathan working on the fiscal rule that we developed with others actually was quite significant, because we now have a Tory government about to adopt the fiscal rule, or parts of it that we advocated, but we need, actually by the time with the initial one, but by the time we'd got to the last election, we wanted to go further anyway, and it'd be tempting to see if they dip the toe in some of the things about how they're going to go further. And again, behind every policy was an extreme amount of detailed work that we tried to, wherever we could, roll out and test as well where we were in control. So community wealth building, the Preston model and the discussions we had around that was one. We had local government in some areas being able to try and test these out. In other areas, it was the workers themselves through their unions coming back to us with their ideas from frontline staff about how things would work. And I'll just give you one example, which is quite important in the last few weeks, is we developed a flooding policy and how to tackle flooding based upon environmental team that we had that was led by George Monbiot and looking at land use. But we also had the FBU talking about the response mechanisms, what was needed in funding, what statutory powers they had, and who should have that responsibility. So all of that was quite detailed. And I think as we go forward, I don't think we should underestimate the work that has gone on and the way in which actually what we need to do now is build upon that, because the challenges change literally day by day, every week as well. But this big thing about how we wrap it up into winning the argument. So that leads me on to the next advert, which is on Thursday the 5th of March, at 6:30 this time, Jack, isn't it? The title is How Do We Win the Argument? How do we communicate our policies effectively? What does hegemony look like? This event will look at the developing the narrative and the communication strategy that secures the support Labour needs. And I think along with that is Greg Philo, some of you will know from the various communications groups, Ken Loach and others that are coming along to talk. But I've also most probably going to get some representatives of our community campaigning team as well, where there's a good piece in The Guardian today about them. Then on the 24th of March, securing a socialist Labour government, what we're up against, who is really in control. The seminar will look at who really controls society, finance, capital, question mark, the media, social media, giants, and big data, question mark. So we'll sort it out by then, okay? Thanks a lot for coming along, and thanks for the panel.